So we've talked a bit about Roosevelt and his critics. And so in this segment, I want to be a bit more specific, and we'll talk about a number of specific critics and what they had to say, these voices of protest, if you will, during the 1930s. First of all, Charles Coghlan, known as Father Coghlan, the radio priest. He had begun broadcasting quite early in the 1920s a regular show or regular broadcasts on radio from Michigan, from Detroit. And Coghlan, in his weekly radio sermons, castigates Roosevelt for basically out-hoovering Hoover. In other words, simply not being radical enough in his efforts to use the state on behalf of addressing the problems of the Great Depression. Now, you have to take this, sort of think about this in terms of the negative side here of Coghlan, because Coghlan would also basically attack communists on the one hand, capitalists, and he was extraordinarily anti-Semitic. And he had an association with no less a figure than Henry Ford, who in the early 1920s had begun publishing in the Dearborn Independent some very anti-Semitic thoughts and arguments that he had, and had come out strongly during the 1920s with anti-Semitic views. Coghlan runs in much the same vein. During the 1930s, he will join with no less a figure, and we'll talk about him in a moment, than Huey Long in this campaign against Roosevelt. And he will organize a national union of what he called social justice, the National Union of Social Justice. But Coghlan's ideas, his opinions, were very much on the sort of reactionary level. And he was sympathetic when Adolf Hitler began his emergence to the rise of the Nazis in Germany and the National Socialists during the 30s. In fact, Coghlan praised the organization rather vociferously. Another of the major critics of Franklin Roosevelt was a doctor from California, Dr. Francis E. Townsend. And what Townsend proposed was, again, based on this idea that Roosevelt simply wasn't going far enough. Townsend looked around and saw the suffering of the elderly, in particular, people who had saved for their retirement, and then when the Depression had hit, whether it was lost in stocks or lost in other ways, they had lost the capacity to keep themselves out of poverty. He was pointing out that often it was not just working families, but it was those who were least able to adjust their incomes who suffered in the midst of the Great Depression. And so what Townsend proposed, he called the Old Age Revolving Pension Plan, or sometimes we'll call it the Townsend Plan. It was published and put out there for popular reading. And he also established Townsend clubs across the United States. Now, the way this old age revolving pension plan was to work was that basically the government would establish a fund that would pay out to those over the age of 60. It would pay out to them approximately $200 a month. Now, the estimate was that this fund would need to run somewhere around $20 billion. There was a condition attached, however, that those who received the pension monthly would have to spend the amount they received by the end of the month. Townsend argued that this would benefit the aged, it would benefit those in need, but at the same time, pumping the money back into the economy, forcing the spending of the money, would do what Roosevelt was in essence trying to do. It would put money in people's pockets. Sorry, not people in people's pockets, but money in people's pockets. They would spend it. That would encourage greater consumer confidence, greater production, and reduce unemployment. This is an amazing idea, an idea that ultimately Townsend argued would be funded with a 2% business tax or sales tax on every transaction. But it was highly impractical. It would have gone further than Roosevelt, but highly impractical. So, thus far, not to hold up straw men here, but we have two ideas that Coghlan and Townsend, they both catch on with the American public. Coghlan is listened to broadly by radio listeners. He'll have his followers. But we also have Townsend, who gets clubs started across the United States. And these ideas begin to spread. Perhaps, though, there's no greater sort of figure than Huey Long. Long emerges from the American South, and my gosh, he's just such a character in so many ways. He's known as the Kingfish, and the idea there, of course, is sort of the king. He is raucous. His oratory is how shall I put it? It appeals to the lower classes. It's blue collar. He is, in the truest sense, perhaps a demagogic figure, appealing to the people very directly. Well, in 1928, Huey Long had been elected governor of Louisiana. His slogan in that election had been, "Every man a king, but no one wears a crown." If that's not the sort of populist message, that there'll be no excessively wealthy, there'll be no excessively powerful. Every human being, every person, even the lowest of the low, deserves to have some piece of the American pie, so to speak. Now, to be perfectly, to be sort of perfectly clear, I guess here, Long was often associated with some pretty dark politics. He had built for himself in Louisiana, and would do so as governor, a massive political machine, so that Huey Long, the Kingfish, controlled the state. He was not in any way concerned with using graft and bribery and other such remarkable, or perhaps not so remarkable, tools to maintain his power. But Long always appealed to the people, and the people of Louisiana in particular. 1930, Long is elected to the United States Senate from Louisiana. Having consolidated his control over the state, he has himself elected to the United States Senate. During that period, he will initially support the New Deal. His period of his first senatorship, he will support the New Deal. But his criticism, like that of Townsend and Coghlan, is really that Roosevelt simply isn't going far enough. That the Economy Act suggests that Roosevelt's still a conservative at heart, and that the NIRA, in fact, does not undo big business sufficiently in its control over the economy or supply the material needs of the American people. He begins to believe that Franklin Roosevelt, over the course of the first few years of the New Deal, has fallen a slave to the interests of big business and capitalism and finance. Well, in 1934, Huey Long comes out with his Share Our Wealth sort of philosophy. And he will, like Townsend sort of does, Huey Long will create chapters of this Share Our Wealth societies, as they're called, that will spread across the United States. The basic philosophy that Huey Long espouses is that the United States government will use its powers to tax under the amendment to the Constitution allowing for a graduated income tax, that the United States will use its power to basically take or seize all income over $1 million and all inheritance over $5 million. Long then wants to redistribute this wealth to the American people. He will argue that the funds that are garnered through this tax scheme will give each family a homestead allowance of $5,000 and an annual income of $2,000 so that families can become landed, so that they can sort of live the American dream, and they'll have more than sufficient income for that dream to continue. By 1935, the Share Our Wealth Societies can claim approximately 7 million members across the United States. Now, it's worth noting that what happens to Long in Louisiana, in the state capitol building, is that in September of 1935, he is shot and he dies. It's a sort of convoluted story of basically an individual who expected to find a place in the Long machine and then is left out. But regardless of what happens to the Kingfish himself, the ideas of the Share Our Wealth Society persist in the United States. Perhaps the most extreme critic of Roosevelt's New Deal from the side of the complaint that Roosevelt hadn't gone far enough were the communists. And in 1935, the communists in the United States shifted from their publicly announced goal of overthrowing the U.S. government to a position of cooperation. They would work through labor unions, student groups, writers. And by 1938, the Communist Party of the United States of America could claim about 55,000 members. Now, there are a lot more people in the Share Our Wealth Societies than there are, of course, in the Communist Party. It always remained on the outskirts of American political life, and yet it was a party of considerable influence. And while the idea of overthrowing the United States government had been let go, understand that from the communist perspective, capitalism itself was a dubious prospect. And so there's no way Roosevelt, who arguably is trying to salvage a capitalist system, can really be seen as working cooperatively with the Communist Party. And that's exactly what the communists argued. That ultimately the changes that needed to be made were systematic in the United States, and that the reforms and the programs that Roosevelt put forward through the New Deal simply were not aimed at fundamental change to the American system. Now, I focused thus far on sort of critics from the left, or critics who claim that Roosevelt, to whatever extent, needed to be more radical. I shouldn't say the left. Certainly you can't say Coghlan's from the left. But those critics who argued that Roosevelt needed to be more radical, needed to stretch the Constitution more, or in the case of the communists, really sort of abandon constitutional restriction. But you also had voices from the opposite side, voices which argued that Roosevelt had gone too far, that he was usurping powers that were not his to usurp. And let me suggest that one very important area for that criticism you began to see emerging really, really early. It's not a loud voice in 1933, but you begin to see hesitance by the end of the first 100 days as Congress is passing all this legislation, sort of rubber stamping Roosevelt policies for the New Deal. And I think one of those early voices, and a voice that will continue to plague Roosevelt throughout the 1930s, will be sort of Southern conservatism. You have to remember that following Reconstruction, we speak oftentimes of the solid Democratic South. It was a Democratic South that had won a certain amount of redemption with the election of Woodrow Wilson and the coming to power of the Democratic Party in Congress as far back as 1912. But now with Roosevelt's huge win for the presidency in 1932 and control of both houses of Congress, this minority of Southern Democrats found themselves in positions of power. The thing is, as long as the Democratic Party nationally was a minority party, as long as Republicans dominated, then you have to understand that these Southern Democrats are sort of the majority or the strongest center in a minority party. But what begins to happen as Roosevelt takes charge is that these long-serving Democrats who can count on being elected over and over from the South and from Southern states now assume positions of great authority. They assume, for instance, committee chairmanships and things of that nature, and they are inherently worried about federal intervention in the South, particularly when it comes to local control and the maintenance of control over labor, and that, of course, entails race. You may recall that I mentioned that Roosevelt will maintain, even in certain New Deal programs, most New Deal programs, he will maintain sort of this localism, allowing, for instance, segregation to persist in such organizations as the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps. So you can kind of see where, over the course of the 1930s, Southern Democrats are in a kind of tough position politically. On the one hand, they're in positions of power. They want to keep those positions of power. They have a certain interest in supporting a Democratic president like Roosevelt, and yet many of the very programs upon which they're asked to vote threaten the basis of their political power in the South. It's a tight spot. So often what they'll try to do is to sort of pull Roosevelt back. When they feel that he's being excessive, when he's going too far, when he's operating against their own interests, the regional interests, these Southern Democrats will become a voice of reaction, but limited. And there will be occasions, though, where they'll outright oppose Roosevelt. And this is particularly true in the latter 1930s. Another conservative voice that was attempting to put a check on Roosevelt's sort of expressions of executive power would be the Supreme Court. And I'll wrap up this segment with a discussion of the court. But there were two major cases that I want to mention in the mid-1930s where the Supreme Court basically said no to major programs of the New Deal. The first of these came in May of 1935, and the name of the case is Schechter Poultry versus United States. The basic issue in this court case was the sale of dubious poultry to a butcher, and this case comes out of New York. And under the guidelines established under the blanket codes of the National Industrial Recovery Act, there were expectations about having any meat or chicken inspected and making sure that chicken, in this case, actually met certain standards before it could be sold. Well, Schechter Poultry arguably had failed to meet those inspection standards, had sold less than quality poultry, possibly sick poultry. And that was the crux of the matter that the court had to decide in 1935. What the Supreme Court says, and by the way, I've hesitated saying it, but I'm going to go ahead and say it. What the court decides in the so-called sick chicken case, Schechter v. U.S., what the court decides is that in passing the National Industrial Recovery Act, in spite of its efforts to set codes locally. The United States government has exceeded its authority under the Constitution. Now, the issue at the heart of the case, at the heart of the decision, is the so-called Commerce Clause. And that's a clause in the Constitution which gives the United States government, the federal government, the right to oversee, regulate, manage, however you want to put it, interstate commerce. And the argument being made in the sick chicken case, what it boils down to is that the regulation of local affairs in the way the NRA had set out to do that actually contradicts or is not allowable under the Constitution. So the court effectively strikes down the power of the NIRA to compel adherence to the blanket codes, to the standards upon which it relies. In 1936, there's a second case, United States versus Butler. This case will invalidate the Agricultural Adjustment Act. Agriculture has always been, and the court sees it as, a local issue subject to state, not federal action, according to the 10th Amendment, which says that those powers not specifically delegated to the federal government belong to the states and, or, of course, to the people. But the real issue, the crux of the case, centers on how the money will be raised for the parity payments. And under the Agricultural Adjustment Act, the money to make those parity payments will ultimately be paid into the federal coffers by a tax on processing. In other words, if I'm going to grow wheat and I want that to be sold, it's going to have to be processed and turned into flour and such like, so that processors would have to pay a tax to the government that would then go to support the grower. The argument that the Supreme Court makes very simply is that the act, by demanding that tax be paid, is an instance where the federal government has exceeded the powers granted to it under the Constitution, and thus the mechanism by which the AAA would work is invalidated. So by 1936, we have voices from multiple sides attacking the New Deal. We have the Supreme Court invalidating two of the most important pieces of legislation that make up the structure of this New Deal that seek to address the issues of depression. And the Roosevelt Coalition might seem to be in trouble. The capacity of Roosevelt to persist in this New Deal might seem to be in trouble. The Roosevelt Coalition of which I speak, and which you ought to know, really entails those parties with an interest in the New Deal programs. Farmers, African Americans to some extent, members of the middle class. One of the things I haven't really dwelt on but ought to mention are homeowners, and I have mentioned, for instance, mortgages and the protection of mortgages. One of the major programs to come out of the New Deal will be the Federal Housing Authority, which will assist home buyers and homeowners with mortgage payments and securing credit. So we've got labor, remember Section 7A, and you put all this together, you have this considerable collection of interests in the New Deal, and yet you have these voices protesting. And the New Deal Coalition, as it's called, is relatively fragile, really, like most political coalitions. There's a general notion of sort of shared interests, but there are also many, many differences of opinion. It's difficult, for instance, to see Southern conservatives, these members of the Democratic Party from the South, linking arms with some of the more radical elements of the labor community. and workers. And yet, in the Roosevelt Coalition, they both have a place. We'll talk more about this Roosevelt Coalition a little bit later. And in the next segment, I'll move along to look at what's often been called the Second New Deal. And we'll see what happens with the New Deal and with the Roosevelt Coalition.